Is Microsoft Unified Support busting your IT budget? Well, you're not alone. US Cloud is the global leader in third-party Microsoft enterprise support, and they're helping enterprises slash cost by 30 to 50% versus Microsoft Unified, all while getting faster response times from domestic engineers. No offshoring, no long waits, just expert support you can count on 24/7, 365. Trusted by 50 of the Fortune 500 companies and offering senior-level engineers with an average of 14 years experience with Microsoft technologies, US Cloud is the smarter alternative for premium Microsoft support without the premium price. Ready to make the switch? Book a call at uscloud.com to get started today. That's uscloud.com.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Another weekend perspective, or maybe just sort of a weekend observation this week. But had a chance to be at a couple of different events over the last couple of weeks in which we were discussing different types of success, early deployments of certain types of AI applications. The types of applications don't really matter. I mean, they were the typical things you tend to hear, a mix of chatbots, document summarization, developer copilots, all those types of things that we've talked about a lot. But what was interesting was kind of this trend I'm seeing, and again, I say trend, I shouldn't say trend. It's, a couple of data points and maybe it is just some insight. Maybe it's an observation, but maybe it is a trend. And what was interesting was kind of this, as I discussed with a number of the people who are rolling these things out, and I guess they would probably consider themselves a little further along for some stuff. They felt like they had worked through some things. They had certain governance in place. So this wasn't, your old classic sort of proof of concept, first time trying something, weren't really sure what they were getting themselves into. But they brought up an interesting topic around kind of how to justify the cost of AI versus justifying the results, or at least measuring the results. And I won't get into all the details, sometimes you want to be conscious of not necessarily giving away names and so forth. But I want to talk a little bit about kind of the discussion that we had, as well as just kind of the ramifications for other companies or for people that are kind of starting to implement some of this technology, the thought process that goes in around that. And so I want to dive into that after the break.
This episode is sponsored by Postman. Postman is the world's leading API collaboration platform, and they just launched Postman AI Agent Builder, the quickest way to build AI agents. Start building at postman.com/podcast/cloudcast.
And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, I want to dive a little bit into some things I've been reading, some discussions I've had recently with various companies around, kind of their deployments around AI, the things they've learned in the early months and maybe year that they've been deploying some stuff, and some of the sort of challenges and psychology that they're now starting to deal with as they become a little more familiar with the technology, familiar with usage patterns, familiar with how they're justifying cost, all those types of things. And I thought there was a couple of interesting things that were worth kind of talking about today. And I'll begin by sort of saying, when we talked about most AI usages, most AI applications, especially as we've sort of put them in the context of, sort of enterprise business usage, not necessarily like just making an avatar for your social media or, making a fake video so that you can, troll people on the internet, whatever that might be. But a lot of times, the way, if you were to sort of categorize them, or the things that you've seen from successes, kind of fall into either kind of human augmentation, right? We're trying to help people be more efficient with what they do, relieve them of doing some of the kind of low value things, but allowing them to spend more time on stuff. So there's still very much people in the equation. And there's lots of examples of that. A developer copilot's a great example of that. And then there's sort of another category of them that would be sort of human replacement, right? So the goal is we have a task that, if they sort of really mapped out what the task was, it could very much just be kind of completely automated, right? In this case, we happen to be using AI technology to automate it. We hear examples of this, of like, hey, we've got a staff of people who do nothing but, look at changes to I don't know, legal documents, for example, or something related to their industry. Maybe it's changes to building codes or something, and they come out with a bunch of documents. They're hundreds of pages. They could now feed those into some sort of LLM. The LLM could summarize the changes without really having a human in the loop, right? So we see some of those types of things as well, and those fall more into the sort of human replacement category in terms of the task. And I'll start with, if we think about it, technology has, either augmented, shifted, or replaced human tasks for a while, right? So this isn't necessarily anything new, right? Every one of us experienced this. Maybe if you go to any sort of retail store and they allow you to now check out, do self-service checkout, right? You're able to bring your groceries and run it through the scanner and bag it and all that stuff, as opposed to going through the checkout person, right? That's a simple thing. We've seen things like over time, farming equipment has become, the technology around farming equipment has become more powerful, more automated. The amount of work that any single person could do with a, set of tractors or whatever is far more than it used to be with, many, many people with, large laborious animals, mules or oxen or whatever it might be. So, we've seen this for a long, long time in lots of different fields. It's not, specific to anything. We've seen the conversation that people have of, within IT, you should automate more tasks. Maybe you're using an Ansible or a Terraform or something like that. And, again, same sort of things. It could be replacement of task. It could be augmentation of task. It's always some combination of those things. And so this, bringing AI into it isn't a new conversation for any industry, let alone the technology industry. But I think what we're seeing is a little bit more of just kind of the acceleration of, what's possible if the technology is applied in the right place, right? And we've also seen for a long time that management or owners of businesses, have always tried to replace workers with technology where possible, because again, you could argue, lots of reasons for doing it, but at the most bottom line reasons, when you've got sort of technology as opposed to people, the technology doesn't tend to get sick. You don't have to pay it overtime. You don't have to pay it for vacation. You don't necessarily have to pay things like taxes, Social Security taxes or other sort of, safety net taxes, insurance, all those sort of things. Yes, you do have to maintain the equipment. It does have bugs and technology problems and all that kind of stuff. And, but, the perception is, the more you could leverage technology as opposed to humans, if you were just looking at it from a bottom line perspective, this has been a thing for a long, long time, right? Even technology doesn't necessarily introduce this, right? We've seen this in factories, robotics in factories, building cars, all sorts of stuff, right? So again, this isn't specific to, new technology, i.e. just AI, right? We've seen this for decades and decades and centuries. So I think what I'm kind of getting at and what I've seen lately is a couple of interesting things. So I had a conversation with a couple of different companies out at events over the last couple of weeks. And one of them was sort of interesting. This was a company who has rolled out a decent amount of AI. In fact, they highlight it on their website and other types of things. So, really good for, kind of showcasing what they've done, showcasing what technology they've used, regulated industry stuff. So, allows their peers to sort of see what's going on there and so forth. And the conversation sort of went like this. They had rolled out, like I said, a set of different technologies, some sort of chatbot, so some human engagement stuff, some internal facing stuff, some external facing stuff, some stuff to augment software developers or operations people, some stuff to, try and classify content and a whole bunch of, things, your kind of sweet spot, bread and butter, low hanging fruit, Gen AI stuff. And what was interesting was as we were talking about things and where they were going and some of the stuff that they were looking to do, they brought up an interesting question. They said, hey, we have rolled out a lot of stuff. And one of the metrics of success that we've used is adoption rate. So for example, in one of the areas, they had rolled it out to X number of thousands of people. And one of the measurements they were using was what was the adoption rate, either on a daily basis or weekly basis. Again, it depended on the task and so forth. And so they were seeing, relatively high adoption rates. I think it was in the, plus 60%, maybe it was closer to 70 or 80%. And they were using that metric. And then what they were running into was, so on one hand, they felt like they had gone through all the things that you normally should go through in terms of is this viable technology? Have we put certain things in place to be able to sort of track it from an accuracy perspective, hallucinations? Are we aware of who's using it? And are we putting certain things in place to make sure that, the wrong information doesn't get in the system? So they'd kind of gone through, we think we've done a lot of the right things. Again, still early days, recognizing that the things can get better. What was interesting was their initial measurement was what was going to be the adoption rate. And I think the reason for that, and what they sort of started telling me, was they had sort of been told by the people who provided the technology to them. This wasn't sort of all homegrown. They'd used a vendor and an outside party to sort of drive some of this stuff. Was that they had said, well, the success rate you're going to see is something like 50 to 60% greater output as a whole. So sort of augmenting the people that are going to be using this technology by 50, 60%. Right. And this was, based on what the provider had used in whatever studies they had measured. And again, it's always your mileage may vary, your use case may vary, and so forth. But the reason this sort of came up was they felt like, okay, we use that number to then build a business case for, adoption of what they wanted to do. And part of the business case was also, reaching this level of adoption in terms of volume, right? So like I said, the 60 to 80% usage. And what they sort of came back with was they said, well, what we're seeing is we're not necessarily seeing that much additional productivity, right? And they gave me a different number. So just assume it's, less than the 60 to 80% or, 50 something percent greater productivity. Maybe it was 20% or 15% or 30%, whatever it was. It wasn't that level. And what was interesting to me was the conversation wasn't about how do you think we could get the level of additional efficiency up. They said, we're now starting to be asked by senior management, how do we go from like 50 or 60, whatever they were at, let's just call it 30%, just so we can talk in the same thing, or like 30% greater efficiency, to replacing the people. And, as we were talking about it, it didn't feel like a radical conversation, right? This wasn't an organization that was, or, the couple of organizations we talked about, they weren't, a company that was like massively venture funded. And so they felt this huge pressure because they had a huge valuation. This was a very stable company, a well-established company, had been in place for a very long time. But it was very interesting that they were sort of jumping to this thing of, I didn't get to where I was initially, and I want the technology providers to help me get from, let's just call it that 25 or 30% additional efficiency to 100%, when the initial number that they had built their business around was like 50%. And I thought it was sort of fascinating to sort of hear the logic behind this. And I think the reason I bring this sort of stuff up is, and I'll kind of walk through what we then talked about, was I think there is potentially a very growing feeling that if you're doing this sort of part way, you're not going to get there, or you're going to go through a lot of work to not necessarily get there, and you need to set your goals higher. And I'm not necessarily saying that's the right way of doing it. I'm simply saying I'm starting to get this feeling. And the reason I say this is I feel like so much of what we've seen in the AI market to date has been kind of the narrative of it has been driven by a very small number of companies, very, very large companies, very huge amounts of funding, or able to put a lot of money into what they're doing. And they're talking about it in the context of enormous amounts of change in very, very small amounts of time, right? And I point to things like, we hear whoever it is, whether it's OpenAI or Anthropic or one of the leading sort of AI labs, saying, "Hey, we are just around the corner from AGI. Maybe we've already reached AGI or super GI, super AGI, right? These labs that are saying like, oh, we've already sort of reached that, or we're literally right around the corner from this." And so I think that has sort of accelerated people's perspective on, when is this thing going to happen? But then we're also starting to see all these conversations happen again, whether it's the O'Reilly group saying, hey, software development will never be the same again, or we're hearing, we no longer need software developers. We're already hearing, we're not going to need operations because there's going to be these agents. We're hearing over and over again in different industries, like there won't be entry-level people. We're seeing certain companies, I think it was either Spotify or Airbnb or somebody this week, their CEO had sent out a notice, a memo, an internal sort of thing saying we're no longer hiring people until you can prove that you've exhausted all of your resources using some sort of AI tool to do the thing that person could do. So hence, you've proven above and beyond what it can do, what AI can do, to then hire another person. And again, whether that's the right thing to do or not the right way to do it, we do tend to see certain trends, certain sort of herd mentality happen in the technology industry. And I think because, especially given what's going on in the economy right now, whether it's, bumpy or we're headed down a path of recession and all those sort of things that people are talking about right now, people become the sort of fodder in how to fix these things. And so I think it's really interesting just to sort of watch that, right? We've seen OpenAI now talk about having these PhD level agents that they're going to charge $20,000 a month to be able to do very high level tasks, which I think is interesting. Like before, everything had sort of been, this thing can help with low level tasks and so forth. We're starting to see sort of rhetoric about kind of attacking the higher level, high value jobs and so forth. But on the flip side, we're also starting to see companies, struggle with this, right? So I put a couple of links in the show notes there for a couple of articles and the information, which in some cases the things are published in front of the paywall and behind the paywall. People know how to get around them, but I put links to them. Their AI, the analysis that Salesforce with their Agent Force, their new sort of AI technology, is really struggling to provide people with sort of replacement types of technology. So, we talked about this a while ago. You can tell a little bit about where a technology company is sort of placing their expectation of the technology based on how they price it, right? So, for example, most of the Microsoft sort of Copilot types of things are done on a per seat basis. And if you kind of map that out, you would assume, well, if their growth is on a per seat basis, their goal wouldn't be to reduce the number of seats, i.e. the number of people, but more so to get you to pay more per seat. But again, sort of in the augmenting people category of how pricing's laid out. Salesforce, on the other hand, is done not on a per seat basis, which is the way previous sort of Salesforce types of things, access to the customer records and all that kind of stuff, CRM stuff, was done per seat. This is now being done on a per task basis. So, for example, if you're doing this as a customer service type of agent, it's like $2 per query, right? So every time one of your customers engages with customer service, it's like $2 for Salesforce, right? So that is very much intended to be like a replacement type of technology, right? And people can do the math of like, what does a normal customer service agent call, cost, and how many inquiries do you have, and what's the average number of inquiries per engagement, or all that sort of stuff. And you can figure out the math. But they're apparently sort of struggling with that. And so I think it's going to be very, very interesting to watch the way in which both the technology companies as well as the using companies, the end user companies, are sort of looking at this. And I do kind of get this sense that there is beginning to be a little bit of a trend, or a little bit of an exploration of how do we make this more replacement oriented. And I think it's a difficult situation. And sort of one of the conversations that we kind of had as I was talking to some of these people is I said, look, in many cases, you're not going to necessarily hear the technology companies, and the more I think about this, maybe this isn't necessarily right. I think you're going to hear a set of technology companies saying, we're here to augment what you do, right? And how much you augment that, how aggressively you augment that is completely up to you. I think you're going to hear a different category of technology providers. And again, this could be consulting companies. This could be, companies looking to have huge public valuations, because right now they're a private company and they're taking on a ton of venture funding. I think you may hear them pushing more and more this idea of sort of replacement, because that, number one, doesn't necessarily have a timeline on it, and two, if you're a business or you're somebody valuing the company like that, that may seem like a greater possibility of huge valuation somewhere in the future than it does sort of saying, well, everybody's going to kind of get 20% better, 15% better, or 10% better, or 40% better, whatever that might be. So I think it'd be very, very interesting to sort of watch that. I think the discussion that we ended up having was, what do you, as the end customer, want from your discussion? Like not from the discussion, what do you want from the goal of whatever your project is? And I think where we kind of netted out, without going into all the detail, was we sort of said, I think you got to be very careful in terms of where the message of what the goals are comes from, and how fine grained you get to, right? So for example, we were just sort of talking about like building applications just as a category, right? And I said, on one hand, if you're sort of pushing the idea of, we want our current development team, or even future development team, that are working on things that differentiate your business, to continue to be valued within the company, the conversation you're probably going to have is, how do we augment them, right? How do we take you from an excellent team, an excellent developer, to an even better one, right? One who can, offload certain tasks. Maybe it's, writing, tests or whatever it might be, documentation, to somebody who is, able to, in some iteration, in some future iteration, able to spend more time thinking about architecture, thinking about, ways in which you can differentiate the business through user experience or whatever it might be, versus sort of holistically saying, we want to eliminate the need for software developers in our company, right? Maybe you're thinking, we want to go all low code. We're going to give, business analysts and product managers and salespeople the ability to just sort of go, hey, whenever I got an idea, I can work with this tool and it will write some software for me. And my goal out of that is, let's sort of shift. Maybe it's shifting, maybe it's replacing those tasks that used to go into the queue that some software developer would build and maintain, and we're sort of pushing them out to something else. Or maybe we're just simply pushing them to, some sort of agent in the future, one of these super agents in the future, and they're going to do that. And the reason I kind of put these two side by side is, if you're granular in how you're explaining what you're trying to do, you can avoid the problem of like, do we kill morale in across the board when we're really only trying to target certain things? Are we measuring the success of an augmentation or the metrics of an augmentation in the same way that we measure sort of a replacement or a shifting type of thing? And this is where we sort of got into, a lot of this really is going to depend on the leadership of the company, what their goals are, how they communicate things, how they are, because this is huge sort of, shifting, changing what people do, right? And we're seeing more and more articles come out about, just using the developer use case of, what does that challenge mean? What does that new environment look like, depending on what the management push is, right? And I'll put a link in the show notes. There was a very interesting article recently of kind of a company who had kind of gone all in because the leader of the team had said, I'm going all in myself, and so I think the rest of you should kind of go all in. And the scope of what they did in their day-to-day stuff is just a manager, limited coding, more, using the tools for other types of things. Taking that mindset and pushing it down onto the development team was having all sorts of weird, adverse, unexpected kind of behaviors, right? So anyways, I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Again, it's just, one example, one data point. But again, all these things, I think are starting to bubble up a little bit. And again, technology in and of itself is sometimes very interesting. It has certain characteristics, but technology always has certain byproducts, if you will, certain ripple effects that happen because of what's going on with the economy, right? So if the economy is struggling, we tend to look for technology to kind of help us, improve the bottom line, kind of reduce. We think more in the reduction or elimination sort of mindset when things are going well. And we've seen this with companies growing in VC funding. We tend to think in the innovation and growth sort of mindset, right? So the technology is never sort of in and of itself in a vacuum. So, excuse me. So with that, I would love to kind of hear feedback from folks, right? I try and use a lot of these weekend perspectives as both, kind of things that I'm hearing out in the marketplace. But, I'd love for them to be, kind of feedback mechanisms from you. Like what are you hearing in your organizations as you talk to people across the marketplace, across the industry, at different events or different, meetups and community things and so forth? Where are you seeing in terms of the spectrum? Are companies, trying to do more in terms of augmentation with AI? Are they trying to do more sort of shifting or replacement with AI? What are the things that are driving that? What are the things that that they may start down the path of saying, hey, we're looking to do replacement, and certain unexpected things, certain organizational things, certain process things, certain psychological things are kind of getting in that way, or allowing it to happen because it is, different than they maybe would have expected. So anyways, just again, not sort of a perspective, is more of an observation this weekend. Just some stuff I've seen over the last couple of weeks. And it does get me sort of thinking of like, I think we're going to have to be a little more flexible, a little more understanding of just the dynamics, that this is not just what can the technology do, but, what is the impact in terms of, people understanding what your goals are, people accepting what your goals are, people, measuring themselves as individuals against what tools can do. People tend to have very high expectations of themselves or beliefs in themselves versus being very critical of what things that either could augment or replace certain things can do. And, we see this with technology all the time. So really curious what other people are seeing. Just some stuff that I've started to see as I've, deal with companies and talk to people around the world and so forth. So anyways, with that, I'll wrap it up. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's April is going well. And with that, I will wrap it up and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.